The Gospel of Mark. Welcome back to our last lesson on the Gospel according to St. Mark. We hope that this has been a wonderful experience for you as we finish up, and we go now to the most dramatic chapters in the whole book of Mark. We go to chapter 15, which deals with the crucifixion of Jesus. We begin by seeing that Jesus goes before Pilate. He has in chapter 14 been before Jewish authorities and was condemned for blasphemy. Now he goes before the Roman perfect, who is Pontius Pilate. We know a whole lot about Pontius Pilate, and we believe some of it. There's a lot of different traditions about who he was, where he came from, what he did as prefect of the region, and what he did after his time, his encounter with Jesus. So there's a lot of tradition out there. Most of it is not real reliable, we think. But in accordance with the type of position he had, he was probably part of the equestrian class. The equestrian class was that group of men who were wealthy enough so that they could provide a horse for themselves, at least traditionally, as they went into military service. He rose in rank after a number of years of service, we don't know how many, and he was appointed to this position probably starting in the year 26 of the Common Era, or 26 AD. Now, his responsibilities as prefect were basically kind of police-like work. He had a group of soldiers, estimated between 500 and 1,000, who were basically a police force. This was a police force within the area of Judea, and he supervised the police force. Although they refer to as soldiers, they probably function more like what we would call police officers. He also had responsibility for judicial oversight, to see that the courts were administered, the criminals punished, and so forth. Probably the most notorious of his responsibilities would have been the oversight of the tax system. His responsibility to see that the tax system worked, that the tax collectors got the right amount of taxes in, and that they got that right amount of taxes to the imperial officers. We have a number of different sources for the life of Pilate and for his interaction, especially with Jesus. All four of the canonical Gospels describe Pilate in some way. Some of them are unique to that particular gospel writer, but there are some things that they have in common. There are other gospels. There are a number of other gospels that did not make it into the New Testament, and in which Pilate appears as an actor, a character, as a historical figure who's interacting with Jesus. We have the work of Josephus, who tells about this period of time and his histories. Josephus lived just after the time of Pilate, and just after Pilate was the prefect in Judea. So he had some very early traditions that he had access to, that he incorporated into his writings. A contemporary of Pilate was Philo of Alexandria, and we have some information from Philo about Pontius Pilate. We also have a plaque. There's a dedication plaque found in Caesarea Philippi, where Pilate is named and his title is given. There had been some debate over his exact title up until that time, but that plaque in which he is identified as one of the important people in the erection of a building was mentioned. There are also a number of coins that he, under his jurisdiction as financial supervisor, was able to get minted. These provide a tad bit of information about Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate relationships with the community that he oversaw depended upon who you ask and when you ask. Most scholars look and say, well, Pontius Pilate was the prefect for 10 years. The whole time he was there, Caiaphas was the high priest, so they must have got along reasonably well, or Pilate would have zeroed him out. On the other hand, from the account in Luke, we get the information that Pontius Pilate and Herod Antipas did not get along very well until the trial of Jesus. We don't have that trial before Herod Antipas in Mark, but we found that only in Luke. Two events in Pontius Pilate's administration are generally singled out as two of his most notorious offenses against Jewish customs and practices and ideas. One is that he allowed the standards of the Roman legion to be brought into the city of Jerusalem. The Jews viewed these standards as idolatrous, and to even enter into the city with these standards was deemed blasphemous. Pontius Pilate was the fifth of these Roman prefects to govern in Jerusalem. The four previous ones had always had the Roman standards covered when they entered into Jerusalem. So this marks a departure from what his predecessors had done, but it's usually used to indicate how he disliked the Jews, and this was an expression of that dislike. The second thing that Herod did was he looked around and saw that Jerusalem needed more water, and when you're living on a mountaintop without any water, that's always an issue. And so what Herod did, what Pontius Pilate did, was to raid the temple treasury and take money out of the temple funds and use those funds to build an aqueduct to bring water into Jerusalem. Well, as far as we know, Pilate had this position from approximately the year 26 to approximately the year 36, for about 10 years. And as a result of this 10-year period, there's just a whole lot of legendary material about him. Some of it very positive. In one of the ancient writings that talk about Pilate, he is a Christian saint. And other traditions, not so much so. But in any case, we have all of these traditions. In one tradition recorded about 300 years after the life of Pontius Pilate, 300 years after the life of Jesus, Pilate is said to have committed suicide. An event that happens occasionally among the equestrians who lost their position because of some sort of malfeasance in office, as we would say. But this is the Pilate to whom Jesus is brought for judgment by the leaders of the Jewish community. In chapter 15, we pick up with the ending of the appearances before Jewish officials, and after daylight, when it would be presumably legal for the Sanhedrin to meet, they ordered the guard to take Jesus to Pilate for Pilate's evaluation. before the Jewish authorities, Jesus was convicted of blasphemy. But when Jesus is taken to Pilate, they don't say, well, Jesus blasphemed God. That wouldn't have been of any interest to Pilate. But they told Pilate that Jesus is the King of the Jews. Now that was a charge that would have perked up his ears. The charge from blasphemy morphs into a political charge, indicating that Jesus was attempting to claim kingship over the Jewish community. Jesus confounds Pilate by simply saying, "You have said so." Now, the trial before Pilate's found in all four Gospels, and there are a number of differences throughout. But in Mark's Gospel here, we'll be following Mark's Gospel order. You have Pilate a little bit indecisive here, but then he begins to think and says, I got this dude back here, Barabbas. Maybe I can offer him to the people and see which the people want. That seems very much out of character with Pilate to begin with. If Pilate had an individual accused of what Barabbas had done, murder during an insurrection, he wouldn't have been keeping him around in a prison cell for very long. The trial would have been swift, and the verdict pretty sure, and the execution carried out pretty quickly. But the option here may have more theological importance than it does historical importance. Let's begin by looking at the name Barabbas. Bar meaning son, Abba meaning father. Barabbas, son of the Father. One of the themes, underlying motifs in all of the Gospel of Mark is to show that Jesus is the Son of God. We've seen that at two very important revelatory events in his life already. At his baptism, at the Mount of Transfiguration, and we'll see the concluding revelation that Jesus is God's Son at the crucifixion a few verses later. Jesus is God's Son. Barabbas means son of God. Okay. What was Barabbas doing? He was part of an insurrection. We think, we don't have any real detail about this insurrection, but it appears as if this were like most insurrections of the Jews of this time. It was a messianic insurrection. That is, someone was proclaiming to be the Messiah, someone who was claiming to bring what we would call false hope to the people. So you have this insurrectionist, a real, live, down-to-earth insurrectionist, Barabbas, who Matthew, interestingly, calls Jesus Barabbas, but Barabbas, Son of God, being allowed to go free, while Jesus, the true Son of God, is put up on a cross. The importance then of this passage is probably theological, and it provides the historical framework, if you will, or the historical groundwork for what in Christian theology is referred to as substitutionary atonement. Atonement means getting right with God. Substitution means there's been a substitution. And in this case, it refers to the fact that the penalty for sin was substituted by God by having Jesus die on the cross than by executing real live earthly justice by having Barabbas executed. So Jesus is substituted theologically. This builds on the idea out of chapter 3 of Genesis where death is the penalty for sin. And you have this notion then that because people sin, they die. And death is the natural result of sin. When Jesus' substitutionary death comes into play, Jesus' substitutionary death takes the place of our death, our real death. And we have this new life that's made possible because of Jesus' death. In recent years, there's been a lot of interest in pointing fingers at who was historically responsible for Jesus' death. Some of this comes out of the terrible, awful events of the Holocaust, in which Christian theology about the death of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus had blamed Jews for years and years for that event that happened 2,000 years ago. If we understand Mark theologically, I think, all human beings, or at least those human beings who are willing to embrace Christ's redeeming work, are deemed the actual culprits in the death of Jesus. Well, the soldiers take this as a good opportunity to have some fun at Jesus' expense. They mock him, they beat him up, and he's not in real good health then. And they throw this purple robe on him and gave him a crown of thorns, and they began to bow down and mock him and talk about him as if he were king and they were his servants. Well, after the mocking of Jesus, he is led out to Golgotha, the place of the skull. Golgotha is a Greek word, and Latin is Calvary, and so you'll see those two words interchanged a lot. On the way there, the Romans, we don't know how they chose them, but anyway, they compel Simon of Cyrene to help carry the cross. Scholars are debated over exactly what Simon carried. Everyone thinks it was something very heavy, but in any case, it was either the beam that goes like this or the whole cross. But in any case, Simon is mentioned. Simon is mentioned as the father of Simon, of Rufus and Alexander. Interestingly enough, as we mentioned in the introduction to Mark, there's a man mentioned in Romans chapter 16 named Rufus, who may or may not have been Simon of Cyrene's son. That's speculation. We're not sure about that. On the other hand, there's a bit of speculation about his son Alexander. In the not too distant past, a bone box, an ossuary, was collected that has the name Alexander, son of Simon. And then there's some other writing on there that scholars dispute as to its exact meaning. Some argue that it's Simon of Cyrene, but that's debated among the scholars. But it might be the actual bone box, of the son of this man who carried the cross for Jesus. If you go to Jerusalem, particularly during the Passover or the Easter season, you'll be very familiar with what's called the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Sorrows. This is a ritualized program that takes Jesus through his last stages of his life, and at each particular place along the way, there are prayers, meditations, and discussions about what happened there. The Via Dolorosa. In many Catholic and some other churches, this ritualization of the Passion of Jesus is moved sometimes indoors, but sometimes outside, but outside of Jerusalem is the point here, and referred to as the Stations of the Cross. And it maps out, theologicalizes the movement of Jesus toward his death. Now, in the Christian tradition, there are two different places that different individuals, different scholars, different believers point to as the site of the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. These two sites are very close together, and each of these traditions, the New Testament tells us very clearly that the place of crucifixion and the place of burial were very, very close together. And we have two different places for these sets of events to occur. The historically longest identified of these is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the church where Jesus' body was laid, and not too far away was the place of crucifixion. Since the 4th century, when Constantine the Great's mother went and found this place, that tradition in her day, 300 years after the death of Jesus, identified as the place of the burial and the crucifixion of Jesus was identified. And since that time, there's been a church there that we know about and we can verify through various original sources and so forth, and we don't have to rely on tradition. And so we have this long-established church here. A lot of controversies about this church exists, and there are a number of different Christian groups that have access to it and importance to it, and they don't all disagree. They can't even agree on opening and closing times, so the next door neighbor who's a Muslim keeps literally the key to the church. About 15, 20 years ago, the church needed a new roof, and the Christian groups couldn't get together to put a roof on the church, and so the Israeli Ministry of Tourism forked over some money for a roof for the church. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the oldest of these two. In 1869, another site was identified, sometimes referred to as the Garden Tomb, sometimes as Gordon's Calvary. This was a site located not too far away from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but it reflects a very, very different type of environment. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is busy with all sorts of Christian groups doing their thing simultaneously, and sometimes without much consideration for other folks and what they were doing. The Garden Tomb is a place of quiet reflection, and this appeals to a lot of people, just sort of that quiet environment. When I went to the Garden Tomb, I figured out, I don't think this was the tomb that Jesus was placed into, it says, that Peter had to duck his head to go into the tomb. I walked in without barely nodding my head. I'm 6'4". If the skeletal bones in St. Peter's Cathedral are actually those of St. Paul, he was only about 5'2". And if he had to bend over, and I didn't think that was the tomb. But in any case, whether or not it's a tomb, it does provide a wonderful opportunity for people to have some quiet meditation on the life and death and sacrifice of Jesus. In American society, we have debates about whether the death penalty is a deterrent to crime or not. The Romans didn't debate it, they assumed it, and they utilized that foundation in order to magnify the pain and suffering of people who were being put to death. Being put to death was almost always a public event, especially if you weren't a citizen. Citizens had special rights, but most of the common criminals and insurrectionists were not citizens, and hence could be put to death publicly in humiliating fashion and in a way that increased the suffering and the unnecessary pain. This would be particularly true of those who were deemed as political problems, political issues. Now, we don't know exactly how many people the Romans put to death. Probably tens of thousands of people were put to death by crucifixion. It was a widespread practice, and yet we don't know exactly all the details about how it was done. We've not been able to find how to crucify people pamphlet. There's no book for dummies on how to crucify individuals, and so probably there was a lot of room for individual variation according to the crew that was putting the person to death and the resources available and so forth and so on. We can see something of the question about the precise nature of crucifixion when we look at the variety of the artistic expressions about the death of Jesus. There are all sorts of differences if we take the time to look closely. And all of them, Jesus has his arms more or less outstretched. Sometimes there's ropes. Sometimes there are nails in his palms. Sometimes the nails are in his wrist here. There are just a variety of different ways that the arms are depicted. Sometimes on the upright of the cross, there's what I call a little bitty seat, and the person can kind of sit and put some weight on that seat, and what it does is it makes the suffering last longer. And if it's there, that's why it's there. And then the feet. Sometimes the feet are down like this. Sometimes the feet are crossed over like this. And one foot's in front of the other. We have one bit of possible evidence about the placement of the feet in crucifixion. From a tomb outside or inside of Jerusalem, in that area somewhere, we have the remains of two ankle bones that are pierced by one nail. We think, we have no evidence or no proof other than the two ankles and the nail themselves, that this was a crucifixion. but it seems likely that it is. And in that case, the legs would have been come down, bent over to one side, the two ankles put one on top of the other, and one nail hammered in. We don't know the exact placement of Jesus on the cross, how his body was displayed up there. What we do know that it was agonizing and meant to terrorize the people who were viewing it. If you've ever watched the film The Passion of the Christ, put out about 15 years ago, you can see something of how punishing crucifixion was for human bodies. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus is on the cross for 6 hours, and some other Gospels it's a shorter period of time. But it's a time of great agony. Now, in Mark's Gospel, we see that there was what we would call a painkiller offered up to Jesus. He was offered the wine mixed with myrrh. Wine is a mild painkiller, and some have built on that. I think perhaps it's probably more theologically Jesus is being rejected by the old ways, as in earlier in the gospel, Jesus is the new wine. Here the old wine is going out the door, so to speak. But anyway, Jesus is derided on the cross. When Jesus is up there, you have all sorts of people who make fun of him and jeer, and basically are pretty much glad that they're not up there. You have people passing by. Crucifixion sites were usually places where people pass by. I mean, after all, if you're going to make it as a deterrent or use it as a deterrent, you're going to want people to see it. You don't want it off in the Netherlands someplace. And so you have these people who are walking about, doing their normal business, going into Jerusalem or coming from Jerusalem, and they see Jesus and they mock him. Others go out of their way. You have the chief priests and scribes who come along and mock Jesus. They make probably a special effort out here to humiliate Jesus. And humiliation was one of the punishments that always went with crucifixion. And then you have the two others on the cross. Remember, Jesus was crucified between two others, and in Mark, both these others deride Jesus and mock him. In Luke, one of the thieves repents and becomes known as the good thief. But that doesn't happen, it's not recorded as happening in the Gospel of Mark. Well, we have a number of people who witnessed these events, and we have some idea of what happened. Toward the end of Jesus' 6 hours on the cross, he issues what's called the cry of dereliction, sometimes the cry of abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, some believe Jesus was speaking to Elijah. And in certain streams of Judaism at this time, Elijah was viewed as someone who was willing to help the pious. If you remember from your Tanakh or Old Testament studies, Elijah never died. He went up into heaven in this fiery chariot, and hence his periodic return to the earth was possible. And a lot of different stories and expectations were built upon this. But most of the scholars that I've seen at any rate believe that Jesus was citing from Psalm 22. And it begins with these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? This feeling of abandonment, a feeling that, everything is gone wrong that can go wrong, and I have been neglected, overlooked, abandoned by God. In the Psalms that would talk about being in the pit of Sheol. But here you have this cry of dereliction. But if you read the whole psalm, it starts out with this feeling of great abandonment and isolation and loneliness and just terrible perspectives on the world. But when you get toward the end, it starts expanding and becomes a brilliant hymn or song of praise to God. Scholars tend to divide largely into two groups on this. Some believe that Jesus spoke the whole psalm. I'm kind of leery about taking that position myself. I went out and, tried to simulate Jesus on the cross, put my hands up on the kid's swing set and tried to hold my weight up there for a little bit. And after 20 or 30 seconds, I couldn't read the whole psalm. I could barely mention the first line. But some argue that Jesus had extraordinary strength that I don't claim. But others believe that Jesus recited the first words of the psalm and expected the hearers, the listeners, those at the foot of the cross to understand what he was saying. Yes, in this moment, I feel abandoned. But down the road, there'll be great joy. There'll be great praise. Okay. At the cross, we have the third of the three great revelations that Jesus is God's Son. Go back in the opening chapter, we have Jesus at his baptism. God speaks probably to Jesus only, you are my beloved Son. At the Mount of Transfiguration, God speaks to the disciples, or at least three of the disciples, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. And here at the crucifixion, we have the words of one of the crucifiers, the centurion, the man in charge of putting Jesus to death, of executing the death warrant on Jesus. Surely this man was the Son of God. Note the irony here. The one who is putting Jesus to death is the one who's given final recognition in the gospel that Jesus is God's Son. And at this moment, the temple curtain was torn. Now, there are some issues here, both historical and theological. Historically, we're not sure that there was actually a curtain in the temple. The temple was built in some measure as a way of duplicating the tabernacle. And in the tabernacle there was a curtain. So there may well be a curtain. There probably was some mark of delineation somehow. But in the descriptions that we have of the temple, we don't find it. But it was probably as much theological, or more so, than it was historical to record it. The curtain is torn. It's torn from the top down. In other words, it was up there, we guess, about 30 feet high, and that would be too high for me or you to just reach up there and rip it. So the idea here is that it's ripped by God. It has theological relevance. Now, the theological relevance it has oftentimes varies with what the interpreter brings to it. But at any case, there's this great power that rips the curtain. It is the same power, it's the same verb used back in Mark 1, where the heavens are ripped open at Jesus' baptism, and you have the proclamation that Jesus is God's Son. So this ripping apart here. Probably to some degree or other, the ripping apart of the temple is meant to symbolize the direct access of people to God. You don't have to go through priest, high priest, and so forth, but different denominations and different religious traditions would interpret that very differently. Well, Jesus dies on the cross about 3 in the afternoon, and what to do next? Well, normally under a public execution, when someone has particularly been so offensive to the community that he or she was crucified, the body would be simply taken down and thrown on the ground and left there. A continued humiliation of the body even after death. Death didn't end punishment, but it continued. And hence the bodies would be scavenged by wild animals. Well, Joseph of Arimathea, he was one of the leaders of the Jewish community, intervenes. Arimathea was a small village north of Jerusalem, and he goes to Pilate and gets burial rights, if you will. This was, in and of itself, very unusual, and it must speak to the importance of Joseph in some sense, that he's able to get this concession out of Pontius Pilate. In Second Temple Jerusalem, in Jewish society, the upper classes of individuals, like Joseph of Arimathea, practice what is referred to as secondary burials. Secondary burials mean that placed in one place for a while and then in a second place later on. And what actually occurred was that people would be put into carved out or natural caves and a stone put in front of them, while the flesh and all those decayable parts decayed. And after that, after about a year or so, what would remain would be simply the bones, and the bones would be picked up and put in ossuaries or bone boxes. These boxes that would contain the human bone remains of individuals. And we have relatively a fair number of such bone boxes. We've already mentioned one, Simon of Cyrene's son Alexander, possibly. This is sort of the process by which Joseph has initiated what was going on. Both Luke and John, but not Mark, make a note that this was a brand new tomb. And if it's a brand new tomb, you have a response to one criticism about the resurrection. How do you know that the body that's missing from the tomb was that of Jesus? But if a tomb had not been used before, then that criticism doesn't make sense. Also, in Mark, there's no mention of a guard. In Matthew, you have evidence for a guard being put there, but it's not found in Mark. And the women were just frustrated as they made the trip to the tomb. How are we going to move that heavy rock? How are we going to roll away that stone? And they don't have to do it. Well, the women come to the tomb on Sunday morning, Easter Sunday morning. They had observed the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was over, and now they were going to finish doing the preparation for Jesus' burial. It was a sign of their love and devotion. And when they got there, they didn't have to worry about moving the stone. It was already moved. And they went into the tomb, and there was a young man there ready to give them advice. Who this young man was is a matter of some speculation. There are those who think he was the demoniac back in chapter 5. Others think he was the young man that ran naked into the night at the arrest of Jesus. Others argue that this is an angelic figure, just as in Mark, that he's a young man. The dress, the clothing of the young man inspires some speculation. Some say, hey, it looked like the clothing that Jesus and Moses and Elijah wore on the Mount of Transfiguration, and see it there. Others argue that the Christians buried their martyrs in white linen. And perhaps that's what's being referred to here. But the text ends with the women afraid and voiceless. They go out and they're afraid to relay the message that they have been given. Now, from a historical perspective, biographical perspective, how do we know, that they didn't tell anybody? Because the text tells us they didn't tell anybody, so they must have told somebody. So the text leaves a whole lot of questions unanswered. The ending of the book of Mark, perhaps the most written about part of the Gospel of Mark. There are 5 different possibilities as I've identified them, because lots of people are not happy with our best textual evidence that ends the work at 16:8. One argued that Mark didn't live, or for some other reason couldn't finish the work, and so all we have then is the first 98% or 95% of the work that he would have done if he'd been able to finish it. Yeah. We have no manuscript evidence to indicate that. A second argument is that the ending has been lost. You know? Like one of those mystery books where, people rip the last chapter out of the mystery book to confound the readers. So when they get there, they don't know who done it. Well, we have no evidence for that. Or other options, there's what's called the short ending. There is about a 2-verse ending that's called the short ending, which tries to wrap it all up together and go forward. Well, the short ending has a particular functional problem. Most of the times when we find it in the ancient manuscript, you have 16:8, then the short ending, and then the long ending. So why have the short ending followed by a long ending? The long ending, this is our fourth option. The fourth ending doesn't solve the problem that's raised in the first 8 chapters. It doesn't deal with why didn't the women speak? What brought them to speak? Was there no resurrection? And so this longer ending has a number of different settings and passages, none of which really fit the context of the end of Jesus' life. On a side note here, this is where you get the passage about handling snakes and drinking poison. If you live a life of faith, the snakes won't hurt you and the poison won't kill you. So you have those in this longer ending. Most scholars today tend to think of 16:8 as the end of the gospel as Mark wrote it. We have a number of different issues, though. What does it mean that the gospel just ends? I've looked at some of these, and what appeals to me about what is called the open ending, because we don't know exactly what happens, is that it continues the theme of teaching about discipleship in a very experiential way. Remember, much of the Gospel of Mark was built on teaching the disciples how to be disciples and what to do, how to follow Jesus. Now, it's one thing to follow Jesus when Jesus is right there in front of you, isn't it? When Jesus says, let's go this way, we go that way. That way, we go that way. But what do we do? How do we follow Jesus when we don't see Jesus? The young man tells the women to repeat the news. Tell my disciples to go to Galilee. Tell them to go to Galilee. Following Jesus means that we need to listen and do things differently than we did when Jesus was alive. Well, there are all sorts of understanding about this open ending. That's only one possibility. I'm sure you can find others and probably better articulated explanations about the open ending as well. But this wraps up and concludes our study of the gospel according to St. Mark. On behalf of the First Christian Church of Fort Thomas, that sponsors these talks, I thank you for your attendance and your attention and wish you the very best. God bless you. Good day.